want to do two things in this chat. Give you a little bit of background to mentoring. And why am I doing that? Because it's hot. It's emerged from being, a trusted form of development and training into, one of the hot topics in overall management and education in the last few years. So I want to go a little backwards and look at it in context. But also then want to talk a little bit about the different forms that are emerging and that are available to people and why they're important. Stop me any time. I feel like the ice cream guy. So think of my voice as that little bell that rings when the truck goes down the street, and if you want to get a quick cone, just jam your hand up and I won't give you an ice cream, but I'll try to give you an answer. Something. So we're going to talk about what it is, where does it come from, what forms does it come in, what are the key success factors, and why does it matter? There's a definition. Always start with a definition, not a bad one. Mentoring is the offering of advice, information, or guidance by a person with useful experience, skills, or expertise for another individual's professional and personal development. By the way, this will be made available online, so if you want the presentation. So what's his history? Where does this come from? It's Greek. Go back to your Greek ancestry. There was a guy called a Mentor who actually was Athena disguised. Those Greeks are very sneaky, as we're having slight problems at the moment. But what she did was get disguised to offer advice to a king who was coming in and offer advice. It got rediscovered in the 18th, 19th century, and that's when people started paying attention to it. And there are some very famous classic mentor-mentee relationships. Plato mentored by Socrates, Beethoven with Haydn, Jung with Freud, and in these days, Bill Gates very much with Warren Buffett in a whole bunch of areas, and Sheryl Sandberg, who I'm going to leave you to guess who mentored her, and we'll talk about that at the end. So it's got both career and psychological benefits, and I'll talk about the contrast with coaching in a minute. With career, it's sponsorship. Now, I have a bias. There's a book that's come out from a Harvard professor which I violently disagree with, because what she's saying is the new form of mentoring now has to be sponsorship. And by sponsorship, it means that a senior and important person in the organization recognizes a very talented younger individual and takes them under their wing and moves with them. So if the senior person moves job, they move the more junior person. They become part of the entourage. It's very Japanese, by the way. The Japanese work very much like that. To me, that has far too many associations of politics and selfishness, because the advantage in those relationships is primarily for the mentor and frankly less for the mentee. And as we'll go through how this relationship should work, and when it works at its best, it's very mentee driven. The mentor swallows the ego and is there as advice, as prompting. A little bit of coaching sometimes, we'll talk about that, but the focus is on the mentee's development. It does have coaching in it. I'll put up the definition of coaching in a minute, but coaching really comes out of sports very largely, is telling people how to do things. In order to hit the ball, you swings those that way. If you want to get a puck in the hockey net this way, obviously the Toronto Maple Leafs haven't done much good coaching lately. So that is a component part of it. There's a little bit of protection that goes on, simply because what you're doing is looking after this, not necessarily junior, but more junior person in the organization. But most of all, you're trying to do that challenge. You're trying to push them by beyond where their comfort level might be. So you're asking inquiries, you're helping direct them, you're not telling them, you're getting them on a voyage of self-discovery, and giving them some exposure as much as possible. Psychological, you're in a role modeling world. Doesn't mean you want them to become like mini versions of you. In fact, great management does quite the opposite. Always get depressed by organizations where everybody who works for a particular executive or manager looks like them in mentally and attitude, behavior, and background. Always worry about those organizations. But there is a bit of role modeling because they're looking at the more senior person for, how did they get there? Why did they get there? What was it? Counseling for sure, for difficult dilemmas. Mentee relationships sometimes get into the personal. Mostly it's about work and experience, but there is an overlap because as we struggle to each of us find out what is the balance in our lives that we actually want. And I think about three elements that we all need. And by the way, I do this extremely badly, so do not follow my advice. You need to spend time and commitment to your work, you need to spend time and commitment to your family, and you need to spend time and commitment to yourself and your own values. I'm hopeless. I'm about 90% on the first one. My nickname in Japan was 7-Eleven, because that's the hours I work. But you're trying to get other people to get that balance going more correctly. Acceptance and confirmation. What you're doing there is reinforcing the courage of people to bring on their own ideas, to be upfront with how they think about things, what their viewpoints, even if they're quite radical. The mentor relationship must be, if it's in New Orleans, it stays in New Orleans. It doesn't get spread around. So you see why I worry about the sponsorship stuff. Because what there must be is the trust that builds that you're able to say, frankly, I think that person's a bloody arsehole, but that's what I need to do there. How do I put up with them? And that should be part of the relationship. And there's a lot of caring in great mentor and mentee relationships. Two types, this is some of the things you were asking. The big explosion has been internal. A lot of organizations, somewhat unthinkingly in a lot of cases, have slapped in internal mentorship programs. And often they've done it badly. They've done it as part of direct report systems and say, you are obviously the mentor. And that may be the right way to go, but it isn't necessarily the right way to go. Some do multiples. I was just talking to a very senior marketing guy a couple of weeks ago, and he's got 3 mentees in his organization. It's a large financial institution. And his 3 mentees, one is in his department, one is in the IT department, because this guy's particularly good at communication, and they want to bring on this IT person. And one, interesting enough, in this company, it could be from any department, but it's defined as a millennial, because they've identified in the organization that they need to bring in the millennials more into the mainstream of understanding what this financial organization is about. It certainly aids people through the competence, knowledge, and judgment. And the great advantage is the mentor knows the organization, so can help guide within the context of the organization. So they can focus on specifics. In order to really succeed here, you need to develop this skill, goes on. Somewhat similar to what Adrian was talking about in terms of some of the people he's guided to take programs here at SEEC. Downside is, and it's not bad, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it can be a little too political. External, there are a number of professional and specialist groups now that offer mentorship programs. I'm involved in one with the American Marketing Association. We have 50 mentor-mentee relationships each year, the American Marketing Association. There are a number of others, Women's Executive Network, and lots of them. What that offers, depending on how the matching system works, is advice related in some way to the specialization in role in life, but it can also be broader. One of the things I try to push in this with mine is that there's learning in mentor-mentor relationships, whatever your background. Peter Drucker said something very important a number of years ago before he died, that the for-profit sector probably has more to learn from the not-for-profit sector than the other way around. And what he meant by that is stakeholder management. Not good not-for-profits have had a much more complex stakeholder system to manage than most for-profits until recently. Now the for-profit organizations are recognizing that we have to go beyond the shareholder. We got to talk to the community leaders. We got to pay real attention to our staff. We got to pay attention to the community. So that learning. But my point is, you don't need a linear mentor-mentee experience to be of value In fact, some of it, the very diversity of the mentor background can be a huge advantage of triggering thoughts that may not come from a linear relationship that you might have experienced within one particular role or one particular job. Other types, you can have informal systems and formal systems. Informal systems have lots of advantages, but they tend not to be very well specified in terms of goals. So the goals are often specified, outcomes are not measured, access may be limited, there's a self-selection process that goes on, and there's indirect organizational benefits. One of the great things going on now, I always get the name wrong, but one of you may know this, 10,000 coffees? Is it 10,000? It is, yeah. Which is, people sign on to go and have a coffee with somebody. Justin Trudeau, I think he needs the help, offers himself as a mentor. There are a number of senior leaders around. But it's informal. You meet once. You don't necessarily meet regularly. You're not trying to achieve anything. And really, you're just kind of getting advice. Again, nothing wrong with this. This is good use of people around you and good use of networks. The formals actually try to get you to be a little more focused on achieving things. And good formal mentoring systems, whether internal or external, have goals you actually want to accomplish during the period of the mentorship process. So there's some kind of measurement. Generally, there's recommended that there's an agenda that you go through. So you talk about, I want to talk about these 3 issues, which gives the mentor and the mentee both a chance to reflect and make the actual discussion session a little more valuable. But some formal mentoring systems, internally and externally, don't work because they're with the wrong people. The matching's not there. So that's why there's still a value on the informal. So my theme here is not that any one of these types is automatically right. But as a mentee and as a mentor, you need to seek out what blend works best for you. And I'll come to why that's important in just a minute. There's often lots of confusion. As I said, this is online. You'll all get copies. But there's a lot of confusion between coaching and mentoring. So what I put up is some of the contrast. Think of this not as a 0-1, but as a range, as relative emphasis on a 1 to 10 kind of range. Coaching tends to have a view of what is correct behavior. That's why the sports analogy works. Somebody's with a particular swing in baseball, that's just not working. The coach directs the learning. The subordinate in that relationship is there more accepting of instruction. I go there to find out from this person who's really good at what they're doing. There's a lot of instructing with some feedback, and it's very much based on immediate problems and opportunities. I need to fix this now. Often concentrated, and in many cases the coach is the boss. As you look over the mentoring side, you see the shift in power. Because the power in the first one comes because you're going to a coach because of their expertise. The shift in the second one is the mentee, the mentor serving the mentee, not the other way around. You're guiding. So you're offering support and personal guidance. The mentee drives the agenda. Both are volunteers to it. There's a longer-term personal and career development expression that goes through it. And it's in the relationship, it's listening with a lot of, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Think about this. When we meet next time, what you might have done is this. So it's if you like, a more helpful process. But the big contrast is, it's not for you to dominate as a mentor. It's really serving the needs of the mentee. What are the characteristics of a great relationship? It's a partnership. The mentor and the mentee are partners in it. And that's why you often get really strong friendships. Think about some of those famous examples I gave you. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett most impressively. Who's the boss of those two, for God's sake? Gates has really identified what he could learn from Buffett. He really, I don't know if you've read Gates' comments about his relationship with Buffett, but he opened up this man's world. He literally transformed Bill Gates from being the nerd that Bill Gates said he was and only focused on one thing, which was money, to a much broader understanding of what he could be, how he could develop the company, both while he was still engaged in Microsoft and then subsequently with, bluntly, one of the great organizations in the world, which is the Microsoft Foundation, which he and Gates and his wife have put together. Communication needs to be open. That's why you need the trust. That's why it doesn't need to be political. It's safe space. You know, you're allowed to say things about the organization, about, you know, your doubts about yourself. Confidentiality, joint accountability. No, it's not just the mentor or the mentees or say, we're meeting then and, you know, oh, I can't make it, and you do it 5 or 6 times. You know, we have some examples of that. AMA is some of the minority of failures with the AMA is when neither side has taken accountability of working together to fix it. Respect. You know, I mean, most mentor-mentee relationships aren't with absolute juniors, although there are some. You know, I teach most of the MBAs, but I have undergraduate classes I teach. And I was with a group last night in an organization called ISEC, which is a global exchange organization for students. And I'm sitting there with a bunch of 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds, and I'm thinking 2 things. I'm going, oh shit, I'm feeling old. But then I'm watching how the board of advisors to this group is actually working with them. And they're running a little business here at the university. It's called ISEC. They have finances and they have to go and accomplish goals. And it was absolutely wonderful watching how the relationships between the board of advisors and the students. They weren't telling the students what to do. They were saying, have you thought about? In my experience, because they're all previous ISEC members, so and watching the juniors talk amongst themselves and feed in the learning, but obviously not automatically accepting everything, and that's good. Because the last thing you want is have a generation of people who do exactly the same as the old farts they work for. That's really bad news. You've got to be responsive to the goals and needs of each other. So again, it's very much a partnership. Mentors. How many people in the room have been or are mentors? A lot of you. So a lot of you know this already. So well, when we do the questions, I want you to chime in what we've missed. You gain pleasure from developing others. It's part of a managerial skill, but in fact, it's also enjoyable. You're proud of, not threatened by accomplishments of others. You actually want them to shine. You're not a good mentor if, and somebody told me about this very recently, that they work in a very large hospital, and their boss keeps on taking their best work and putting their name on it without attributing it. You know, still happens, folks. It's sad. Anyway, so guess what I'm telling her? You know, look for another job, you know, if that's going to continue. They're good at reading people and situations. You have a good relationship, you know. I mean, you know, obviously I love Adrian for a whole bunch of reasons, but mostly because of, not just because he's taken lots of programs, but because of the way he talks about his people. Remember he said, you know, instead of saying that you need to take courses, he took some of his people around and said, is there a link here that you're getting? So yes, it was a bit of a false discovery process, but it was very driven for the individual to do that. So I don't believe, by the way, Adrian was ever really bad at the HR and personal skills. I think he's exaggerating that for the purpose of his talk, because he's got clearly great relationships with his people. Tolerant of individual differences. So let's talk about that a minute, because one of the challenges of mentoring is when you're dealing with people who come from totally different spaces than you. Age is certainly going to be one thing. Ethnic background is certainly going to be another thing. Religious background, maybe another thing. Skill set will be another thing. So you've got all these things. So it means that, you know, as an old white male, I've got to recognize certain biases I have in my view when I'm dealing in a mentoring relationship. So I've got to make sure I really explore what's coming out. One of my great friends was HR director for IBM globally and retired about 4 or 5 years ago. And I complimented her once, and I said, you know, one of the things I admire about IBM, Deb used to work there, is IBM's hired well. It's hired diversity well. I mean, like, really, and they believe in education and training and development. I mean, there still remains a great organization. And she said, Alan, we've learned how to hire them, but we haven't learned how to use them and listen to them. And I mean, that was a great insight. We're still this large, still somewhat technical, despite the move from hardware to software. We're still not listening to the diversity in our midst, and that's a critical part of what needs to be done. The mentor likes giving back, and hopefully a generous, optimistic spirit, and I noticed all the people with their hands up are all smiling, so that's obviously correct. Great mentees. Potential. It doesn't mean they're the high smarts or the hypos, as we sometimes talk about these people. Anybody can be a hypo, but they have got to want it. There's got to be that desire to improve and not stay where you are. So I regard anybody as high potential if we can find a way in, providing they're actually prepared to want it and go for it and work for it. One of the things that happened in my life, which was really powerful, wasn't so much an individual mentor, but a cultural mentor, which is when I first went to Japan to run J. Walter Thompson. And a quick story. I had a driver in Japan, it was lovely. And in the first 2 weeks, he bumped and hit somebody else. And I didn't think too much of it, but then it happened again about half a dozen weeks later. And then he ran a red light, and then he crashed into a police car while I was in the back. So I go to the personnel director of the company and say, tell me about Toshima-san. And there's any of you know, been working with the Japanese, there's a phrase I use, which is when the air leaves the room. Middleton-san. And you've touched a real sore point when the air leaves the room. And of course, they don't want to tell you. I was a new president coming in and everything else. My friend at Mitsubishi may have some sympathy with this. Anyway, what eventually came out was this guy had joined the company 40 years earlier, at the time J. Walter Thompson was setting up for the first time in Japan. He had worked in every single job in the place and failed at it. And the only place left for him before I arrived as the foreigner was the president's driver. And he was clearly struggling with that, because after he hit the police car, I said, I know you don't want these gaijin coming in and taking over, but hell, you see, you're the right place. Eventually we had to buy him off. It cost us 5 years of salary to buy him out and all the rest of the stuff. But as I began to understand it, I began to understand a very important thing about good Japanese organizations, that they agonize about what to do with the people. I was taught a phrase by my head of personnel. It wasn't a big company, it was about 600 people, 4 foreigners and the rest Japanese. And it was said to me very clearly early on, Alan, it's our job as management to find the right place for our employees, because it's our fault if it goes wrong. And I thought, what a wonderful perspective. And yeah, it used to drive me crazy, the endless bloody Japanese meetings. Do you have long meetings with your... Yes, they go on.
Which ones are the ones that, because of the time difference, we have our meetings that are at the end of our day or the beginning of their day.
Oh, yes.
So we have our 6:30 at night calls, which is the first thing in the morning.
Yep.
And they want to talk for hours.
Yep.
Of course, our meetings that are, when it's the end of their day, are rather quick because they want to go home.
That's it. That's the way it works. But in there is a concern about getting the right fit for the people. And I like that a lot. I think it is very much a responsibility. So high potential, it can be anybody. It can be, to use Adrian's line, it's the guy in the warehouse who wants to get on. Let's not lose them. Interest in learning and development, they've got to be open to advice and help. Obviously, otherwise it's not going to be valuable. They've got to be capable of progressing, and part of training is making that happen, allowing that to happen, filling in gaps where people may have gaps in their experience or background or learning. Able and willing to partner in their growth and mature enough to recognize the value, and building the trust to get the right questions. So what's the process? Mentee needs to be clear about what they want for it, and the mentors must understand and value it. That's the coming together. We're in this together to achieve X. This is what we're trying to go. Good relationships, by and large, set goals, they set the agendas, they formalize the process a little more. It's an active process, it doesn't take up endless time. AMA, I'm sure Deb won't mind me, Deb's on the board of the AMA, by the way, and has been past president. Our mentor of the year this year had a mentor-mentee relationship. Was it Calgary or Edmonton?
Calgary.
Calgary. A Calgary executive mentoring a Toronto mentee. And it was so good, even though they couldn't always get together. He did whenever he was in town and everything else. But the relationship was so powerful that the recommendation for both is that he became the mentor of the year for the AMA. So distance, yeah, it's a barrier, but it needn't block. Be prepared to listen to each other. Keep a record of the advice. I mean, my mentees are taken on. I've got one this year. Oh boy, he takes lots of notes. I get scared. You know, somebody's actually paying attention to what I'm saying. Oh my God, you know, and enjoy the process. Why is this important? Where's the give back to the organization? And it's here. Because great executives and managers, and apologies for my pathetic PowerPoint, I'm hopeless on graphics, so I wanted to actually draw a four-legged table, because that's the way I see it, but I got arrows instead. Great leadership management capability comes out of four things. It comes out of the obvious things like experience. You know, but have you picked up things through the experience that transcend that specific example? In other words, are you seeing the themes? Obviously, I'm going to say it comes from training and education, because that's obviously a critical part of it. You'll find in our brochure the 70-20-10 rule, that the 10% that the input of training and evaluation may sound small, but it's a critical element for making the other two elements work really well. It's mentorship and coaching. It's that relationship with people so you can draw on it. And it's also who you use as advisors. So those four things, people who use those four things well tend to be better executives and managers, you know, providing they take the advice and the learning. So organizations need this. You know, SEEC does a survey, and it reflects virtually every survey in HR. What is the number one skill that's required? And we ask HR execs, we ask department heads, we ask senior execs. And it gets reflected in virtually every survey in Canada, the US, and most of the developed world. Leadership is number one. And it's leadership at all levels. It's not just leadership at the top level. It's the ability of inspiring, setting the right direction, and inspiring and leading people in that direction. Not in the old command and control style. You know, I mean, you go back 100 years, it was very much military. And, you know, you were the boss and you told somebody what to do, so they ran around and did it. We're in an age where that is much more difficult to make effective, and in fact, it's not. Mentoring aids development, reflection, and knowledge transfer. So it becomes critical in this world to all organizations. Oops, was that the end? I think that's the end. So the value is to the mentor, makes them a better manager. If they have good mentoring relationships, the very experience of going through that and doing it well, and no, not everybody should be a mentor. But it's a sufficiently critical management skill that people should aspire to be a mentor, either internally or externally. Mentees, there's always that need for development and guidance. But you know, it's got to be, you've got to engage in it, you've got to be volunteer. But also organizationally, for that reason. You know, why, you know, coaching, mentoring is so hot right now at very senior levels, and that's why I put the early famous people up. Because there's a misunderstanding developing in some of the literature, which our book's going to try to address a little more, that it kind of stops at a certain level. You know, the biggest demand for coaching these days is personal coaching to senior executives. And that can also be mentoring. If you've got a good board, by the way, one of the great providers, and I'm going to mention one of my clients here, and one of their previous clients, which is the client is currently Samuel and Son, and the current president and most of the board came from one of Canada's previously phenomenally successful industries, which was Defesco. Defesco was bought by ArcelorMittal out of India, although headquartered in Belgium. And the relationship between the senior management, the next level down, and the workforce was superb. And in Samuel, we're trying to build that on. And the president gets mentored by the strategic advisory board of the board. So there's that ability, the president can reach out and say, what can I do in this situation? And it's a special unit, and a number of boards are beginning to move in this direction. Because the old clumsy, and I apologize to any lawyers or accountants in the room, the rather lawyerly and accounting orientation of the board is, financial due diligence, of course that's critical, and choose the CEO. Well, sorry, it's more than that in this world. It's about helping them, helping set the strategy. It doesn't take away their authority. So this works at every level in the organization, which is why it's important. So, questions, comments, brickbats. If you're going to throw something, make it nice and soft in a roll, because otherwise I'm a coward. Thoughts? Yeah.
Alan, great presentation. Thank you very much. I think one of the other big benefits is a symbiotic mentoring, sort of between the mentor and the protege or the mentee, especially with the new millennials, etc. As yourself and folks who are the older generation are not up to speed with all the technology, and I find in some of my mentor-mentee relationships, you can learn a tremendous amount, especially with technology and Facebook and all the other stuff. So I think there's a kind of a symbiotic relationship, as long as both parties are open to helping each other.
Yep, very much so. I mean, the technology's a strong area for this. One of the other big gaps is organizations and executives who are not necessarily very familiar with technology are a bit slow sometimes in understanding how it can improve processes and everything else. One of the big gaps we find is our IT people have difficulty communicating that to the non-IT people. So I'm getting a head nod there, right? Yeah. And mentorship is part of this. Interesting, the example I used with a financial institution, marketing guy, one of his mentees is an IT person. So absolutely. But to your point, it can also go the other way around. You've got that skill set and that ability of just seeing the technology automatically. Well, it can do this, and this. Why aren't you doing it? And I sit there with the thumb in my mouth going, okay, how much is this going to cost me? But I mean, hopefully you all say the number one most important thing. Do we just need to transform our existing process, or should we reprocess? And that becomes part of the symbiotic discussion. Absolutely. Yeah.
Alan, something I think explains or helps to explain the boom in mentorship.
Yeah.
Is the millennials, and
yes.
Millennials particularly are not just desirous of, but open to that kind of. It's that why that you've spoken about so often.
It is. I think you have to be careful about this, though. The other characteristic of the millennials, as we learn about them, as they take on more responsibility, is a suspicion of automatic authority. In fact, trust in authority figures. You look at the Edelman results of their trust barometer, and there's some new work that's just been published in the States based on this. Trust with all formal mechanisms is just crashing across the board. Who do we trust? Who's been going up in all the surveys is, to exactly your point though, peers, friends, family. So the seeking out of counsel as a mentor-mentee relationship for somebody non-millennial, somebody older, will only work if the principles of mentorship are applied. Because if you start turning it into telling them what to do, they'll run off in the other direction. Because that's the traditional authority relationship. So yes, but the principle of allowing them to explore and find their own way with your help becomes even more important.
Yeah, the other thing, Alan, with the younger people, I found out in our organizations that guy who works on the floor who became a lead hand, and
Yeah.
promoted to the supervisor, and now he wants to be the manager now. So this is all happens in 9 months. You know, take your time and be patient.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to learn to groom yourself to get to
Yep.
those next steps, and that's one of the things that you have to teach people.
Absolutely.
It takes time to get.
Absolutely. The only thing I'd add to it, I totally agree, and you're the guy with the experience there, is to always explain why.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You know, I mean, we're in a why world now, not a what world. You know, you're not going to get the millennials to respond to you by telling them what to do without why they should go through that experience. It's like your kids. You know, think of the 2-year-old. What's the favorite word for a 2-year-old? Why? Oh, no. Well, yeah, no, or why? Yeah, no. I want you to go to bed now. Why? You know, you go around, there's all these why words. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. But that explanation of why something goes on. For instance, I have a rule in my classes with the BBAs. Get there on time. In fact, I lock the classroom door after 10 minutes after I start. Don't let them in. But I always go through an elaborate process why this is important. I get them talking about it. What does it do to your time if somebody arrives late? What does it do to your group if you have to, oh, but don't forget, they also said this because you weren't there. And we go through why timekeeping actually matters. Because if I just do it, it's arbitrary and my popularity scores go down and they don't listen, and so it's useless. So that why explanation. So again, the why is like a mentee relationship. It's letting them drive. Doesn't mean they've got the answers, but it's important they find the answers. You know, it's like everything in life. You're going to get better commitment if they've come up with a solution and they're committed to it than if they're just doing it because they have to tell you. Either that or the only other model that's around that's effective is the military. You know, and they have to, otherwise they get shot. You know, the Brits did a really good job back in the 18th century. They put their best rifle people not at the front, but at the back. And they put the gun carriages behind them. So if you wanted to run away, you had to clamber over the gun carriages, and the best shots would turn around and shoot you. You'd die. So you had a better chance of surviving if you went forward rather than back. Well, except at the Battle of Waterloo, which was a bit of a mess, which Laura knows lots about because she loves the history. But aside from that model, model where we need the intelligence of people, where we need the engagement, where we need the millennials to come on, it's going to be much more about that sharing relationship.